So I'm going to talk about the biennial model in general, and then I'm going to talk a little about the Mercosul biennial in particular. So I call it biennalities. Maybe the sarcasm is lost in English, but it rhymes with banality. Much has been said about the crisis of the biennial model, but paradoxically, we see every year new biennials sprouting up in some part of the world. There was an article in Contemporary magazine some years ago that said that every continent had its biennial, save for Antarctica. But that was before the biennial of the end of the world started in Ushuaia in Argentina. So that far out territory has been symbolically claimed by the biennial model as well. Critics point always to the same: funneling of public or private money towards a spectacular event concentrated in time and space. Reiteration of the same artists from one biennial to the next. Mimesis with art fairs to the point they resemble each other visually and conceptually. Biennials are to studio visits what shopping malls are to street shops. Curators go to biennials to see the artists they won't visit in their studios. Biennials end up feeding themselves. But the main criticism to the biennial model seems to be the incapacity to connect with the local public, both the artistic community and the general public of the place where the biennial happens. This last point is, in my opinion, the most critical, not being able to engage the local community. In some cases, they are even done against the will of the local public, who feels vulnerated because resources that otherwise would have been spent in many different cultural endeavors are funneled towards a single large, loud, and visually spectacular art event. Due to our aspiration to be global, we tend to forget that, as Saskia Sassen has remarked, it's only from the regional that a cultural specificity can be achieved, one which does not become diluted in the delocalized magma of transnational culture. In more pragmatic terms, if we are not going to shift the axis of the art world, and I'm talking here about biennials in the third world or peripheral biennials, if we're not going to shift the axis of the art world, it is more reasonable, viable, and strategically useful to become the center of a periphery, like the Havana Biennial was for many years. The motivations to do a biennial are many. One is to have more regional, national, and international visibility for the local artists, and to provide the local public with an opportunity to see what is being done abroad. This is a legitimate aspiration of the artists of any given place. But almost no biennial has been created through the initiative of a group of artists. More often than not, biennials start as political operations that see cultural tourism as an opportunity to generate wealth by attracting the so-called creative class, with the side benefits of situating the host city in the regional or international cultural map. Many city administrators define it as a question of competitivity of their city in the international scene, and in this sense, a biennial can become an instrument of public policy. Since it is an initiative born out of the preoccupations of politicians or businessmen, the structure of the majority of the biennials is based on calculations of cost effectiveness, whose indicators of achievement are attendance numbers and the extent of the free press, which are measurable parameters. Aspects that are more difficult to measure, like the quality of the visit, the effects of the experience over time, the relationship with the academic curricula, the creation of regional networks, and the financing of local initiatives with funds from the biennial are almost never a priority of the decision makers. There are very few biennials, Mercosul among them, which are fully aware of the role they should play in the development of education in their region. Most are happy, having measurable success as operations of prestige. Those issues that administrators choose to avoid don't seem to be preoccupations of the artistic directors they hire either. That kamikaze mercenary breed called independent curator, and I'm one of them now, which usually abide by a structure that precedes them and work obediently within pre-established parameters, limiting themselves to provide the content. Here it is useful to remember the distinction made by Chilean critic Justo Pastor Mellado between what he calls service curators and infrastructure curators. Mellado uses as an example of the former the botanical travelers of the 18th and 19th centuries who classified fauna and flora of the New World for the colonial powers of that time, interpreting the local with foreign categories, and producing detailed inventories of those natural resources, thus paving the way for their capitalist exploitation. On the contrary, the infrastructural curator knows that he or she serves first and foremost a local scene that lacks said infrastructure. The typical scene in the third world is one that lacks, has weak institutions, that has an art scene centered on production and very little or no mediation, few critics or professionalized cultural journalism, precarious or inexistent artistic education, etc. And thus, his or her role of this infrastructural curator should be focused in consolidating that infrastructure and help foster a self-understanding that is not motivated consciously or unconsciously by being critically sanctioned or consumed from abroad. We have to break with a colonized way of thinking that is conditioned by external expectations. Cuban critic Gerardo Mosquera has spoken about curator cultures and curated cultures. But what happens when curated cultures curate themselves? Are they capable of liberating themselves from the unconscious colonial gaze inside the mind of the colonized, the perils of which were signaled by Frantz Fanon? We curators from the periphery are weak and cowardly, taking few risks and always thinking how our work is going to be perceived by the international community, which, as we say in Colombia, does not look at us even to spit on us. Many biennials are conceived in relation to how they will be read from the centers. To use a popular saying, I don't know the secret for success, but the secret of failure is trying to please everybody. So one way not to fall into this trap is, for once, to try and please the local scene, but without falling into localisms. To understand isolation as a positive condition. Since nobody comes here, let's communicate with the centers when and how we want to, and under our own rules. A biennial, and especially a biennial in the periphery, is done for the public of the place where it is held. And thus, it has to take into account its infrastructural role. Whereas a biennial cannot and should not replace an education system, it can surely go beyond presenting a large exhibition. There are many badly planned cultural enterprises which end up having the opposite effects of what they set out to do. We can take as examples the biennials of Sevilla, the BIACs, and the Valencia Biennial in Spain. One of their achievements was to bring the local artistic scene together, but against them. In Sevilla, the local artists created the platform for cultural policy, and in Valencia, the Association of Ex-Friends of IVAM, which bring together an important number of artists, critics, intellectuals, and general public, and which have had their voice heard through newspapers, the web, seminars, and other events, protesting against their respective biennials. Their main complaints are the scarce involvement of the curators with the local scene and the enormous amount of money that go into those events at the expenses of other local initiatives, but also extra-artistic issues like political influence in the decision-making process, bad use of public monies, corruption, and nepotism. But putting aside specific cases and analyzing the biennial model in a more general sense, the biennial institution has an original flaw, which comes with the internationalist aspiration that unconsciously animates it due to its genealogical debt with universal expositions. The biennial is a model in crisis that paradoxically experiments a worldwide growth, just like the neoliberal doctrine or the recommendations of the IMF, sprouting up in every corner of the world, as exemplified by the more than 200 biennials that exist today around the globe. And there is this website dedicated to, charting all of the biennials in the world. And I've worked in many biennials, and a lot of them are not there, so there is certainly much more than 200. The model has evolved little, and it's applied with few changes everywhere. A curator or group of curators chooses theme and uses it as a frame with which to look at the arts scene of their country, the region, or the world, and then produces a list of artists. Those artists travel in average twice to the place, first to see and know the local scene and the city, and then to produce the work and be present for the exhibition. And then in less than a year, an exhibition is produced, which is open for 2 or 3 months in a single venue or multiple sites around the city. Nothing much related to the biennial happens between one edition and the next. This model, with little variations, is followed by 90% of biennials worldwide. Maybe it's in the name where part of the problem resides, biennial. Regardless of if it's 2, 3, or more years that pass between one incarnation of the biennial and the next, the idea of a biennial implies that it is recurrent, but also that it is discontinuous. Hence, one of the slogans against the BIACs in Sevilla: we don't want a biennial, we want art every day. Every biennial is, in a certain sense, a public failure at a grand scale, because there is always a sector that feels alienated or discontent with the decisions that the curator has to take. Since you can please everyone, you should strive to be a success for the local public and consider the rest as collateral damage. In my opinion, what you should strive for is to create local context. All the rest of the decisions must derive from this. The main questions are: for whom is this exhibition made? Who is our natural public? What are their aspirations? Most biennials depart from the old adage, build it and they will come. But even if they do come, what remains of the visit? If the role of artistic institutions is the education of the gaze, then it becomes clear that only through a sustained process can the isolated experience of a work of art become a learning experience that serves not only the purpose of creating new publics for art, but that art can serve as a tool to confront daily life. If we combine those 3 features, 1, the creation of local infrastructure, 2, the emphasis in the local public, and 3, possibilities of continuity over time, maybe we can find a way out of the banality of biennality. Every biennial, or the biennial model, is by definition the show we love to hate. Every time I visit a biennial, people huddle up in corners and rant about it. Having heard or expressed so many opinions about what a biennial should not be, when I was asked 2 years ago to propose a project for the Mercosul Biennial, I decided to create a sort of Dogma 95 of curating, of biennial curating, and posted it on the biennial blog in order to be held accountable of what I was going to do. I called it a duo decalogue, 20 points about what a biennial shouldn't be. Here it goes. In The Pleasure of Architecture, Bernard Tschumi said, if you want to follow the first rule of architecture, break it. Something similar might be said of curating. It is better to be consequent with the organic development of the project than to abide by a predetermined set of rules. A biennial should be poetic prose, not contrived verse. Unlike an encyclopedia compiler, a curator cannot include all the examples that illustrate an idea, only the ones that he or she finds and which are available. Curatorship creates a fiction based on those fragments. Recognizing the impossibility of completeness, all that remains is to try to suspend the visitor's disbelief when faced with parts of a puzzle with no model. As Douglas Crimp says on the museum ruins, the museum is based on the uncritical fiction that the world can be represented through its fragments. An exhibition creates a reasonable fiction, or at least one we want to believe in. If I want to read, I go to a library where I can find information in depth, and I don't have to do so standing up. An exhibition is not an archive. If I want to do some research, I go to the same library that I went for the last point. In the exhibition context, archives either become pure image, which is sometimes right, although not having access to the documents can be frustrating, or they become pure curatorial rhetoric, which is wrong, and it's also frustrating. And we've all seen those exhibitions where you have enormous quantities of documents that are there supposedly to be experienced, but the context of a biennial is not the right context to have research material, in my opinion. If I want to see a film, I go to the cinema, where I can sit down in the dark and the sound comes from what is being projected. Except on rare occasions, films of long duration do not belong in the exhibition space. For example, for the São Paulo Biennial, we chose to, whenever a film exceeded a certain length, we would present it in a film festival, in a proper cinema house, with the artist and one of the curators making the presentation. That's the due respect that you should have towards a cinematic work that has a narrative structure. Based on the orthodoxy of art history, the museum aspires to truth. The biennial does not have its feet planted on a mountain of facts. It's pure speculation. We are not looking for truth, only for beautiful half-truths or lies with the appearance of alibis, believable, useful, and adorned with a veil of suspicion. If the work takes place in time or outside the physical limits of the exhibition space, one has to let it live and die there. There is nothing more frustrating than an exhibition that documents performances, actions, temporary and outdoor works, which are presented to us as a reminder of what we were unable to experience. Unless it was conceived as a work or has a especially significant contextual value, documentation belongs in the archive, not in the exhibition. Every biennial is a lost battle from the outset, since it is impossible to include all countries, all regions, all media, all sexual orientations, all ethnic groups, etc. No matter what you do, someone will always be left out. Based on this ontological impossibility, one hopes for a beautiful failure at most. A failure which, as Harold Seaman pointed out, is one of the poetic dimensions of art. Put 20 recently arrived immigrants from different countries into a container and ask them to have a productive conversation. That is what a biennial aims for, and sometimes it does succeed. It is not a universal exposition, so therefore there is no imperative for equal geographical representation, particularly when these days the idea of the regional often makes more sense than a nebulous and contested idea of nation. How does a Basque artist feel about representing Spain in Venice? What state is represented by an artist from Ramallah? Most biennials are concerned with putting on a spectacular event concentrated in time and space, and when the great exhibition is over, they go into a kind of hibernation. A biennial needs to find ways of extending its action in time and thus neutralizing the post-biennial depression that afflicting the cities that host them. A way of doing it is to understand the biennial as an opportunity to create or consolidate local infrastructure, establishing centers of action which can activate the local scene during the period where there is no exhibition. Artists should not each be isolated in their own space as if it were a booth at a trade fair. The work should dialogue within the space. The resulting text is what we call curatorial practice. Exhibitions and theater are alike in what that they show a work to an audience, only that in the latter the spectators do not move, usually. An exhibition is not a list of works of artists, but instead a physical experience. The way in which this experience occurs in space needs to be carefully laid out. Where do I enter? What do I see? What do I hear? What is the visual conclusion of each movement? A memorable exhibition is conceived in the mind, arranged in space, and experienced with the body. What is the carbon footprint of a biennial? If we consider the travel of the artists and curators and the materials used for production and installation, most biennials, I think no biennial, would receive certification for environmental sustainability. But although some of these ills may be inevitable, because nothing replaces the direct experience of the work or meeting the artist. No one wants Skype curators or BlackBerry curators that are curating by hearsay without visiting the workshops, etc. The approach to the installation process can be responsible and consequent. One has to give up the idea of having a white cube for 2- and 3-dimensional works and black boxes for videos. Each work needs to occupy what is strictly necessary to be experienced without loss. It is not necessary to hide the structure and paint everything white. The exhibition design can be Brechtian in its aims. I prefer creative interference to a dialogue of the deaf, each in their drywall tower. It is not a tech fair where the newest, the most advanced, the unseen will be shown. A biennial, particularly in the third world, which generally lacks museums with large collections of contemporary art or spaces to exhibiting it, a biennial needs to present a mixture of new projects and existing works. I don't believe in biennials as just commissioning works by every artist. I think this mix is really important for many reasons. The local public can appreciate important works which the blasé viewer from the close confines of the art world will find passé. Oh, I saw this in Venice 3 years ago. A biennial is not a show of new talent or a place where curators of other biennials can seek out talent from the periphery. It's not an art school, and it cannot aim to replace it, but it can instead play a very important role in the education of the gaze, which is the function of museums, and a biennial is in many ways a kind of temporary museum. A biennial can fulfill a role of familiarizing audiences from a particular place with the images and discussions of the art of its time. In 1953, let us not forget, the São Paulo Biennial presented Picasso's Guernica. And every 2 years, it has been showing the public in São Paulo the art movements of their time. So many people consider the São Paulo Biennial as their personal museum, a sort of virtual museum of memories. A biennial is a temporary museum that benefits especially the vast majority that are unable to travel to the major art centers. A biennial builds up a visual repertoire in time, a collection of memories which is the artistic heritage of the community where it happens. A biennial can attempt to go beyond the triad that its you know, the staple of mediation in museums, which is interpretation, mediation, and service, which characterizes education work in museums or biennials by involving the pedagogical aspect within its very curatorial approach. The museum always attempts to mediate between art and the public, trying to facilitate this relationship through pedagogical devices that help to understand what is being presented. But art is in itself, and we tend to forget that, an instance of knowledge which is not always entirely rational. Sometimes it is perceived with the senses. In some cases, an image is worth more than 1,000 words. A sound is worth more than 1,000 images, and a smell is worth more than 1,000 sounds. We don't know what it is that will unleash the processes of knowledge. Once I went to the office of Diane Karp, the famed curator and director of the Santa Fe Art Institute, and there was a small sign outside: "There are no art emergencies." No matter how important we think art might be, it doesn't save lives, or maybe it does so, but metaphorically. There are successful exhibitions which manage to make us forget that the process was real torture. This is wrong. In art as well, ends do not justify the means. Organizing an exhibition should not end up being a disturbing, frustrating, or painful experience for anyone involved. A curator does not put his name to an exhibition out of vanity, or maybe we do, I don't know. But instead, it should be as if signing a check to the bearer, a blank check to the bearer. Once it's in the public, anyone can cash it, and you should be there to respond. Exhibitions are organized to provide memorable experiences. I think of curatorial practice as the creation of a temporary community. Artists and curators enter into a dialogue that occurs through working together for an extended period of time, and with a goal that is more or less common to all. I think that successful exhibitions are the ones that I live with close friends. Not that I want a biennial to be a dating agency, although it has worked like that, especially in São Paulo, and in Chile, and in Cartagena, yeah, and in Mercosul, in fact. You know, it does happen. But there is no doubt that it should be a period of empathy. It is hardly ever possible to work with friends. Art offers that possibility. So now I'm going to show you a little bit what we did at Mercosul. When I got invited to do this biennial, it was my 8th biennial. Coincidentally, it was the 8th Mercosul biennial, so there was some kind of numerical thing there. And then in the past work that I had done as a curator, I had tried not to have just a thematic show, but rather choose a theme that could also be understood as a strategy for curatorial action. When we did the Encuentro de Medellín, the theme was hospitality. So we had artists that dealt with the issue of hospitality in their work, but also used the structure of the biennial as ways of provide hospitality. So having one artist-run space be the host for another one, and things like that. Having museums have artists as hosts, etc. In this case, I thought that a suitable theme could be territory, because it always struck me as very odd that a biennial should choose the name of a free trade agreement to name itself. You know, in this age of anti-globalization, nobody would name, you know, your biennial the NAFTA biennial, for example, in Mexico. It would be anathema. But somehow these people back in the 90s thought it was a good idea to name themselves after a free trade agreement. Why? Well, it's very difficult to untangle, you know, what's going on at that point. They wanted to become the cultural capital of the Southern Cone because Porto Alegre is a part of Brazil that feels, in a way, isolated from the rest of Brazil. It shares a landscape and a culture with Argentina and Uruguay and Paraguay much more than with the rest of Brazil. there is a writer, a singer and songwriter called Vítor Ramil, who wrote a short essay called The Aesthetics of Cold. And he says that coming from Pelotas, which is a small town south of Porto Alegre, and then sort of growing up as a musician, coming out of age in the rest of Brazil, he was in Rio and he was watching a program about Brazil, and all that was depicted was the hot Brazil, you know, jungle, beach, samba, caipirinha, garota, you know, everything that conforms this sort of imaginary of Brazil for the rest of the world. But the South was not there. So he said, we must think of an aesthetics of the cold that truly represent us, or better represent us, as being part of Brazil, but also part of the southern part of the continent. And Rio Grande do Sul, until recently, they had an independentist movement. They were briefly the República Rio Grandense. So this idea of territory and nation is very much ingrained in this territory. So I thought it could be a good theme. The logo is done by a couple of artists, that an artistic collective from Caxias do Sul that lives in Paris, that have worked with typography, the Tánico and Lain. And what they did was to take Buckminster Fuller's world map, which you might remember, I mean the Dymaxion Map, which you might remember. It's a new projection that it's geographically correct, thus politically incorrect, because the northern hemisphere appears in its real magnitude tiny, and the southern hemisphere appears, it really is, you know, huge, thus going against the grain of common received knowledge, which is, we all derive from the Mercator map, which is, you know, the de facto map everywhere. Even Google Maps uses it. So they took Buckminster Fuller's map, Dymaxion Map, which is comprised of squares and triangles that form an icosahedron, and decomposed it and recomposed this logo, which is in fact 8 different logos that we used indistinctly, trying to suggest that you know, this is a territory that is in flux, especially when you talk about geopolitics. And we titled it Essays on Geopoetics, and we invited artists to reflect about territory from the standpoint of you know, culture, politics, and economy. So, as I said before, Biennial cannot be just a large show. So, what we did was to have 7 different components. Some of them we called activation strategies. Others were called exhibitionary strategies. And it was all sort of read through by the education component. So in other words, I put together a first draft of the project, and I invited the education curator, Pablo Helguera, who is a performance artist and also a curator, and he's worked in education departments at the Guggenheim Museum and currently at MoMA, so he has a lot of experience in mediation in museums. And I gave him my draft, and he sort of read through and said, we can articulate the education program through the curatorial project proper. So we made some changes to the original project so that the education would be ingrained in the very formulation of the curatorial project. And then we invited the other curators, and we curated collectively. So the exhibition is only one part, and I will speak briefly about the different components. One of them is called Cadernos de Viagem, travel notebooks. And what we did was to ask a historian to do research on the different routes of penetration in that part of the territory of Brazil. You know, when the Portuguese came, when the Jesuitic missionaries came into the land that was formerly of the Guarani Indians, the immigrations of the German and the Italian, and so on and so forth. So we had a good understanding of what were those roots, and then we proposed them to 9 artists, and each one of them chose one route. And what we proposed was that they would do the trip however they wanted to. They could be, walking, or they could take a bike or a motorcycle or a car, however they wanted to do it. And then at their point of arrival, they would do a small exhibition on a local museum of whatever their travel notebooks were. So it could be drawings of their notebooks, but it could also be like the first draft of a road movie, or it could be an accumulation of objects. It could be whatever they wanted. So the idea of the travel notebook, but then it became whatever was most associated to their practice. The only one that didn't do a specific route was Nick Rand's, British artist, that chose instead to draw a square in the territory, and then he did an exhibition in the last place where he went. It's a sort of very complex work that involves it's numerical and involves taking samples of the earth wherever he stopped, etc. And then all these exhibitions sort of were activating different local scenes wherever the artists went, and wherever they exhibited, and happened many months prior to the opening of the biennial in September. So that for the opening of the exhibition, we brought all those 9 artists together in one of the exhibition spaces, and then we had a sort of multiple view of the territory of Rio Grande do Sul, with works that were either the ones that they had produced during their trip, or developments of those works. So these are a couple of images. I won't go into the works. The second activation component was Cidade Nova Vista, Unseen City. So if Cadernos de Viagem understood territory as the territory of Rio Grande do Sul, Cidade Nova Vista understood Mercosul, the city, as a territory that could be explored not only by the artists and the visitors, but also by the local dwellers. Because when you live in a city, you end up by not noticing the architecture. It just becomes part of the landscape. So we identified 9 different buildings or places that we thought were interesting from an architectural or patrimonial point of view, but also from a sociological point of view, like a space, like a garage that was given to a guy who turned it into a used book library or bookstore that has a meeting with people that want to discuss literature every Friday. So that was not exactly an outstanding piece of architecture, but in sociological terms, it was a very interesting place. And we proposed to the 9 artists to make interventions that were not visual, ideally, so that people would go and see those places and experience the architecture, and not necessarily go and see a sculpture put inside of that architecture. So since we were having plenty of exhibitions elsewhere, in this case we wanted to draw attention to the city itself. Of course, that's easily said, but art almost always has some kind of visual component. And there were wonderful projects. Osvaldo Maciá, who is here, did an incredible sound sculpture inside of a 107-meter high chimney of a former power plant that had never been opened. So it was a rare experience to be able to be inside of that chimney for the first time. And I'm just showing one particular project, maybe the most visual one. This is the mayor's office. We invited Tatsunishi, an artist from Japan, and he noticed that there were those busts, in the top part of the building, and that huge clock. So he decided to build a room around it, and we provided scaffolding to climb to that room. And then when you entered, you had the experience of a sort of ordinary room, but the fourth wall of that room was the facade of the building. And once you experience one of these works by Tatsunishi, you will look differently to the architecture. This third component is one of the most important, in my opinion. It's called continents, and it was a strategy that I had used in Medellin. And I forgot to say that I understand curatorial practice as collage, and even as rectified ready-made. So things that I had done in the past, or things that I had seen in other people's biennials that I thought were successful, were appropriated and tweaked until they worked well for this project. So I'm not claiming, I think in the art, especially in curatorial practice, you cannot claim originality. It's more productive to be able to understand what works better for a given situation. So Continentes we had used in Medellin. It was called host spaces. In this case, the situation was similar. We identified 3 artist-run spaces, one in Porto Alegre, one in Caxias do Sul, and one in Santa Maria. And then we identified 6 artist-run spaces or independent spaces in all of Latin America. And then we provided a grant that enabled places from abroad to come to Porto Alegre or to Santa Maria or Caxias for almost a month and set up shop there inside the space of their host space. And they would collaborate and produce a program. So Ser Inspiración from Quito for almost a month wouldn't be working in Quito. They would have a place in Porto Alegre. Then they left. They started for the opening of the biennial, and 1 month after they were gone, and Diablo Rosso from Panama came. And the same situation happened in the other 2 venues. So by the end of the biennial, we will have had 9 different artist-run spaces or independent spaces involved in this process. And if it works equally well as it did in Medellin, where many people from Casa Tres Patios or Taller Siete, some of those places were, in the verge of disappearing because it's very difficult for artists to, pony up the money every month just to keep the place running. After the Encuentro de Medellín, they have all gone to all kinds of encounters, and they entered the network, and Alessio here from Gasworks and Triangle Arts Trust knows them all. And it has been extremely successful in creating these links between artists and spaces. So we think that it's going to work in Brazil as well. So as you see, no exhibition here. It's more a question of creating those links. And probably the most important part of the project is the one that I had most difficulties in getting the biennial to approve. It's called Casa Amy. What I proposed was to create a new independently run space for the city, only that I proposed them to pay for it, so it's a little sort of paradoxical because we want to be independent, but we want you to pay for it. So they said, they are used to doing whatever it takes to do a biennial, but once it's done, it's done. They want to, get done with it, and they were very reluctant to take on this project because it would involve, not only paying the rent for 1 year, but also security, liability, the personnel that is working there, etc., etc. So finally, I was a little sly and proposed, the following rationale. They had, in past biennials, they had given to the city sculptures for a sculpture park that the city has. And in one of the biennials, I think in the fifth, they even had 3 large sculptural works that doubled as urban spaces. One of them, by Carmela Gross, is a series of steps that can double as a sort of mini amphitheater. And there is one by José Resende, which is like a sort of a pier that juts into the lagoon. It's like an observation point. So I said, why don't we consider this a social sculpture? And they said, oh, okay, well, if it's a social sculpture, then I think we can manage. So they did. So but only for a year. So we started in May, and we are financing this through the education project. It's a 2-story house, very narrow, only 4 meters 50. It's really narrow, and it has a space. The first space is like a cafe. Then it has a workshop, and a patio, and then a basement that we use for projections. And then on the second floor, we have a reading room where we were able to put, for the first time, the archives of the biennial. They have a wonderful library that is never used because it's in the offices of the biennial. So it's been made public for the first time, and there is a terrace on top. And the most important is what we did with it, because, a space is an empty shell, and it has to be filled up. So what we have done is to craft a very intense program of activities. Every week there is at least one a duet, where we provide 2 people from different disciplines money so that they collaborate and create some kind of performance thing. And we have the combos, where we invite 3 people of different disciplines to collaborate, to talk about a given topic. For example, I was part of one of those combos with the person that organized the theater festival and the one that organized the cinema festival. And the theme was curating. What does it mean to curate in theater, in cinema, and in art? And the discussions were really interesting. And we also had the funds to bring in 4 guest curators, curators in residency. Each one stayed for 10 days. They visited the local artists. They did a lot of studio visits and reported for the blog. So you see a lot of activities were happening every day, and our intention was that this would become a staple of the cultural life of Porto Alegre, which it did. We also used Casa Emi as a testing ground for our curatorial thinking. We did all kinds of meetings there. Every artist that set foot in Brazil had to give a talk or be interviewed in public by one of the curators. So as to create, and we also had the blog to do this, to create public in anticipation for the biennial. So when the biennial finally happened, people felt that they already knew what it was about, because we had been sort of discussing the issues with them over this sort of period of several months prior to the opening. Well, these are some images of the discussions. And there were 2 distinct exhibitions. One was Além Fronteiras, Beyond Frontiers, guest curated by Aracy Amaral, which included contemporary art by artists that travel in the region, the 3 distinct regions, the canyons, the Pampa, and the missions. And she mixed contemporary art with landscape painting, cartography, and objects from the different cultural groups in those regions. And so it was a different kind of exhibition. And Eugenio Dittborn, this is a show that I curated, the first large-scale solo exhibition of this very important Chilean artist that in the late, in the early 80s, in 1983, created or invented his Airmail paintings, which are mixed media works done on fabric that are folded and sent on an envelope to the place where they are to be shown. And they were done at the time of the dictatorships, thus were also a strategy for bypassing censorship. But going beyond this sort of purely political reading of the work, it sort of highlighted that for the artists of the periphery, and Chile is really a place where you go. You never go through it. It's a destination. And since it's a destination, it's also a point of departure. It's always far from everything. From an artist, for an artist of the periphery, it's very difficult to enter the metropolitan centers. So he has been doing his Airmail paintings since, and they are shown. They travel as a letter, and then they are deployed as if they were a Trojan horse, conquering symbolically the place where they arrive, and they are shown alongside the envelopes that have the exhibitionary history of that piece, texts that refer to the piece, and also the itinerary that it has taken over time. And this is the biennial proper because, well, I still believe in the power of exhibitions, and I don't think a biennial should be an art school or just a series of talks. It has to be an exhibition. But what kind of exhibition? I think that when you have the production model of biennial, where you give each artist a production fee and then give a theme and ask them to produce something, you are forcing, in a way, artists to work towards your own project. And I feel that there is something wrong in that. So I believe more in having like a thematic framework and selecting works, specific works that will dialogue with other works, rather than having artists as an artist list and then having a museographer, an exhibition designer, put them together. So this exhibition was curated in space. Every time we selected a work, we would think what were the implications of that work and with what other work would it dialogue well. And so the exhibition is housed on these warehouses by the river, by the lagoon. It's a very beautiful place. And they are, raw industrial spaces. So for the exhibition design, we departed from a very simple question. What is the ideal way to show a work? And the answer is very easy, inside a box. But when you have that, then you don't have any possibility of relationship between the works. So what we propose the artist is if each work is inside a box, how many sides of that box can we take away? Can we get away with taking away? That was the proposal. So there is this sort of a very simple system, very raw. Everything that was not used for exhibition was left untouched, so raw, and the raw materials. And we ended up having this sort of exhibition device, which was a cube which had only one of its sides, like a shoebox with its lid off, which was the surface where the projections were done. And then another part of that box where you could sit, but it was completely open. It had the sound, so the sound remained inside, but while you were sitting there, you were able to see other works. And then this dialogue that I was talking about really did happen. And then for other works that needed a more secluded space, we had this other variation of it that had this sort of bleachers inside and allowed like 9 people at a given time. And we also used the vast space of the warehouses as a way to have the works as open as possible, but without interfering with each other much. And also darkness as a way to be able to have open projections that were not bothered by the light coming from outside or from other works. And then we set out to carefully establish relationships between the works. If the idea, the theme of the biennial, more than territory, was the idea of nation, what is a nation nowadays, then we sort of had sub-themes like the relation between cartography and politics, the birth of the nation-state and democracy, the relationship between discourse and the emptying of political discourse, and also how the political discourse articulates itself through education, immigration or forced migration, frontiers, conflict, how a nation can be defined not politically but culturally. So what are the traits that define a community? Can it be race? Can it be culture? Can it be the indigenous question and the market as well? Then something that was unavoidable, maps, flags, national anthems, and national seals. We were very careful because when you're doing this biennial, it can become the map biennial or the flag biennial, you know, like this, very easily. So whenever we included works that had, because it's unavoidable, works that had these elements, we were very, very keen that they really reflected on something else and were not just about symbols of nationality. And then we ended with a more poetic approach to the thing. So I'm just gonna browse through some of the images. When you entered, you had these 3 works, one by Leslie Shows, this large flags that seem to be dripping their colors, emptied of their symbolic meaning and becoming like these free-flowing continents. And then you had this mountain of gold, and at the back you had the 2 large drawings. I'm just going to explain just these 3 works so you have an idea of what was our rationale in bringing them together. This is a piece by Eduardo Avaroa, an artist from Mexico, and he had done this piece, he had formulated it in 1991. It was very simple, it's sort of conceptual diagram. He would take that fake gold chain and buy enough length of it to equivalent to the perimeter of Mexico. So it was very simple, but it costed over $60 million, you know, because, you know, 80 cents a meter, there's still a lot of kilometers there. So he abandoned that idea early on. But then when we proposed him a project, he said, well, wait, I have a variation of it. What if I try to make the same, but with the perimeter of this particular island that appeared in the navigational charts since the 15th century, and that remained there because in navigation terms, you don't, even if you haven't seen an island, if it appears in a map, you leave it there because you don't want a ship to run into it. So, you know, even though nobody had seen it, it remained on the charts, and it remained until the 20th century when it was eventually taken away. And nobody sort of worried about it up until the Clinton-Cedillo treaty to do oil exploration in the Gulf of Mexico. And then suddenly, if Isla Bermeja, which is the name of the island, exists, then Mexico can claim, I think, 200 nautical miles more of exploration. So this tiny island suddenly becomes the center of a geopolitical struggle. And if you go online, you will see that there are conspiracy theories that say that the CIA has blown it away so to deprive Mexico of their rights. And the UNAM made, Congress discussed the issue, and they sent 2 different explorations to try and find the island. Nothing so far. So, so this was what the piece ended up looking like. I don't remember how many kilometers of gold chain in the form of Isla Bermeja. And besides it, alongside it, was this beautiful piece by Leslie Shows, an artist from Alaska, who has taken those flags, and then the colors seem to drip from them, and they conform this flowing continents. And then the heraldic elements that appear on those seals establish small narratives on the bottom part of the work. And these 2 works were in relation with Mark Lombardi's drawings, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with. Mark Lombardi, an artist now deceased, American, and he worked as a reference librarian, and he was working on a book on the financial scandals, and began sort of piecing it together, everything taken from the public record. And at a point, he realized that those diagrams where, he could link one person to the next could become an art form in themselves. He called them, I think, analytical drawings, analytical structures, and he set up to do them, and they depict in a very, very graphic manner the interconnectedness of transnational capital nowadays. And as you know, and we all know, geopolitics nowadays about capital, and how what were normally known as the frontiers between countries not matter that much in this sort of flux of capital. So when 9/11 happened, an investigator from the FBI went to the Whitney Museum and asked to see one of his drawings to understand better, what was happening there. It's not very often that FBI investigator looks at art. So we'll just run through them. The idea was to have the works isolated and yet in relation. Works that dealt with the nation of the birth of the nation state, the idea of political discourse, Fernando Bryce, the emptying of those symbols of nationality, and this is an artist from Paraguay, Paola Parceriza. We don't have time to see everything. This is a discourse by the leader of North Korea, Kim Jong-il, talking to the South Koreans about oral sex in North Korea as a way of equality. So other themes like migration, and this is also a very well-known piece by Yukinori Yanagi, done in colored sand and ants that are taking little by little the grains of salt from one flag to the next, thus positively eroding, as immigrants do, the fixed traits of nationality embodied in nationalism. And works about also migration, like Maria Teresa Ponce, whose work large-scale photographs culled from different photographs and digitally pieced together that reference landscape painting of the 18th and 19th century. Particularly Rafael Troya, who was a painter that accompanied many of the botanical expeditions and scientific expeditions. And in this case, she tracks the lands where an oleoduct is going through, and how the landscape is forever changed, both physically and politically. And Barthélemy Togo from Cameroon, and his beautiful work about the markings in his passport. Well, and many other works dealing with the idea of conflict. frontiers. Cultural traits, race, and the market. Yeah, I won't go into them because it's too long. I would like to leave some time to have some questions. All kinds of works about stereotypes, like this wonderful video, it's on YouTube, by Jonathan Harker, or Regina Silveiras's puzzle about Latin American, the Latin American puzzle. And then we had, so that was inside of the warehouses, but we had these containers that were like national representations. And you know, the Mercosul Biennial was one of the last biennials to have national representations. They have been sort of taken away from most of the biennials, save for Venice. But they started with national representations because they wanted to become the Mercosul Biennial. So each country of the Mercosul had a national representation, but not anymore. But I wanted to bring them back. Only that I had embassies or national representations of fake countries. One of them is Sealand, and you know the story. It's outside of Essex. This platform that was claimed in 1968 by an ex-major as a country, and that has a very interesting, history regarding what defines a nation nowadays. The law had to be changed because of them. NSK, State in Time, that had their passport issuing office in their space, and we called these containers ZAPs, which in Portuguese stands for Zones of Poetic Autonomy, because all of these countries don't have political autonomy, but they do have some kind of poetic autonomy. So this was the Kingdom of Laird. And then the pedagogical project, which was really articulated through the rest of the components. Pablo Helguera did a wonderful work with the team of the biennial, and some of the works were done with the community, so that's a rather traditional way to approach it. But we also had, for the first time in Portuguese, a reader of important texts of mediation in museum. He carefully put together a sort of curriculum of mediation in museums, and we did that in Portuguese and Spanish for the more than 300 mediators, as they call them, the docents, that took a 6-month course and that were in charge of giving the talks, the guided tours. So we did this, we did the 6-month course, and we also did 5 other publications. You usually do a publication for the teachers to go with the students to biennials. That's you know what every biennial does, or most of them do. But in this case, we wanted not just the art professors to take their kids to the biennial, but so we devised a book for the art professors, but also, given the themes that the issues that we were discussing, we thought that we put together other booklets so that the literature professor or the geography professors or the history professors could use the biennial as a teaching tool. And we, the materials show them how to approach the biennial so that it can, those works can become useful tools for dealing with the issues that they are discussing in the classrooms. And we also did one for preschool, for kindergarten. And we also did something else that I find really important. We curators wield all kinds of data in presentations, you know, the PowerPoint presentations, and then we say 40,000 students, 1 million visitors, I don't know how many students, professors, they are just numbers. And for example, many books have been published by the biennial in the past, and they are given away. So those numbers exist. Let's say 4,000 books given away in the last biennial of all of the different projects. But nobody knows what really happened with those books. Were they actually used as tools in the classroom? Were they used as aids to visit the biennial? We don't know. So we hired Luis Guillermo Vergara, who was the director of the Niterói Museum in Rio, and his now wife, Jessica Gogan, who was the director of education at the Warhol Museum in Pittsburgh, to make an assessment of the past materials that the biennial had done in other versions, in other editions, and also of the whole process of for this biennial. So they've been doing interviews with everyone involved. They are doing a film, and we are doing a seminar for the closing of the biennial, and it's an assessment with the public to see what really happened and what was at stake, what was successful and what wasn't, so that the biennial and the next curator will have a useful tool when he or she is planning the new incarnation. So I think that's about it. There is a group, you know, the day of the opening, there were several kids with a t-shirt that said, Casa M fica? Does Casa M stay after the biennial? We don't know yet, but maybe there was a blog that I read today. This is the Last Supper at the biennial when I came, and you can see Guy Brett there. He was visiting. I came across this blog where this person says that it's a pity that it's gonna disappear, but maybe they can, if they, you know, unite forces, they can persuade someone to take on this project, or maybe the biennial will. We don't know yet. So that's about it. Thanks for your patience.